Some of the most dangerous patients I have ever treated did not look severely ill when they first arrived at the hospital. They were awake, talking normally, walking on their own, and many of them believed nothing serious could possibly be happening inside their body. That is what makes metabolic disease and heart disease so frightening, not because they always arrive dramatically, but because they often develop quietly while life continues normally around them. A few years ago, I was called into the emergency department shortly after 3 o'clock in the morning. A man in his early 40s had arrived complaining of chest discomfort, sweating, nausea, and unusual fatigue. The nurses told me he looked anxious but stable. When I entered the room, the first thing I noticed was not the expression on his face. It was the warning signs his body had probably been showing for years. The excess weight concentrated around his abdomen, the darkened skin around the folds of his neck, the exhausted look in his eyes despite claiming he had slept normally the night before. Before we even finished speaking, I asked the team to check his blood sugar. The number came back dangerously elevated. I remember asking him a very direct question. Has any doctor ever told you that you may have diabetes or prediabetes? He looked genuinely confused and answered immediately, "No, doctor, I'm healthy." And the truth is, he was not trying to hide anything. He truly believed it. That moment stayed with me for a long time because it reminded me how silent metabolic disease can become. The body is capable of compensating for dysfunction for years before people realize how serious the situation has become. You continue going to work, driving your children to school, watching television at night, meeting friends, living what feels like a completely normal life. Meanwhile, inside the body, inflammation slowly increases, slowly. Blood sugar regulation slowly worsens. The arteries quietly become damaged. And because the process happens gradually, most people never notice the progression until something frightening finally happens. A heart attack, a stroke, a diabetes diagnosis, severe fatigue that suddenly cannot be ignored anymore. That is why I wanted to make this video, not to scare you unnecessarily, but because too many people wait until the body begins screaming before they finally pay attention to the whispers that came years earlier. And the truth is, the body almost always whispers first. The problem is that most people have never been taught how to recognize those warnings correctly. Today, I want to walk you through the exact signs I pay attention to as a physician when I evaluate metabolic health and cardiovascular risk. Some of these signs appear years before a formal diagnosis. Some appear directly on the skin. Some appear in your sleep. Some appear in your energy levels after meals. And later in this video, I will also explain the laboratory tests I strongly recommend discussing with your doctor if you want a clearer understanding of what may already be happening inside your body. Because this is not about guessing. This is about identifying dysfunction early enough that the body still has a remarkable opportunity to recover. But before we discuss tests, we need to understand something far more important. The most dangerous metabolic diseases do not appear overnight. They develop slowly and silently while most people continue believing they are completely healthy. One of the greatest misconceptions in medicine is the belief that serious disease always produces obvious symptoms early. Unfortunately, that is not how the human body works. The body is incredibly adaptive. It compensates constantly. It finds ways to maintain function even while internal systems begin struggling underneath the surface. That is why so many people confuse feeling mostly okay with being genuinely healthy. They assume that if they are still functioning normally, then nothing dangerous could possibly be happening. But metabolic dysfunction rarely announces itself dramatically in the beginning. It develops quietly, almost invisibly. I sometimes explain it to patients like this. Imagine rust slowly forming inside the foundation of a bridge. From the outside, everything still appears stable. Cars continue driving across it every day. People continue trusting it because nothing catastrophic has happened yet. But internally, the structure is weakening little by little. And the real danger is not only the day the bridge finally collapses. The real danger is all the silent damage that developed beforehand while nobody realized there was a problem. That is exactly how insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, and cardiovascular disease often progress. The body slowly becomes less efficient at controlling blood sugar. Inflammation gradually increases. Hormonal signaling becomes disrupted. The arteries become stressed. And all of this can happen while a person still believes they are simply getting older. That phrase worries me sometimes. I'm just getting older. Because many symptoms people normalize are not simply harmless aging, they are biological signals, the body trying to communicate that something deeper may already be developing. Constant fatigue after meals, difficulty losing abdominal weight, cravings that never seem fully satisfied, poor sleep, brain fog, energy crashes in the afternoon. These are often dismissed as normal modern life. But when multiple symptoms begin appearing together, I start paying very close attention. Because metabolic dysfunction rarely arrives as one isolated problem. It creates patterns. And the earlier those patterns are recognized, the greater the opportunity to reverse the process before permanent damage develops. That is the encouraging part many people never hear. The body is often remarkably resilient when dysfunction is detected early enough. Blood sugar control can improve. Inflammation can decrease. Fatty liver disease can improve. Insulin sensitivity can recover. Cardiovascular risk can be reduced significantly. But none of that can happen if a person never recognizes the warning signs in the first place. And one of the earliest and most misunderstood warning signs often appears in a place many people think is only related to appearance. The abdomen. I need you to understand something that modern culture has confused for years. A growing abdomen is not only a cosmetic issue, it is not simply about appearance, clothing size, or aging. Very often, it is one of the earliest visible signs that the metabolism is beginning to struggle internally. And the reason for that is because not all body fat behaves the same way inside the human body. There is a major biological difference between fat stored just beneath the skin and fat stored deep around the organs inside the abdomen. That deeper fat is called visceral fat. And visceral fat behaves very differently from the fat people usually think about when they think about body weight. Most people imagine fat as passive storage, something inactive, something sitting quietly in the body doing nothing. But visceral fat is metabolically active tissue. It produces inflammatory chemicals. It interferes with hormonal signaling. It affects insulin sensitivity. And over time, it creates an internal environment that pushes the body closer and closer toward metabolic dysfunction. I often explain it this way. Imagine your body as a home with designated storage rooms. Those spaces are designed to hold extra supplies safely without interfering with the rest of the house. But now imagine boxes beginning to overflow into the hallways, blocking doors, crowding important pathways, and interfering with movement throughout the home. That is what visceral fat does inside the body. It accumulates in places that disrupt normal biological function. And as that fat increases, the body responds with chronic low-grade inflammation. This type of inflammation is especially dangerous because most people cannot feel it happening directly. There is no sharp pain, no obvious swelling, no dramatic symptom that forces immediate attention. But inside the body, blood vessels are becoming stressed. Hormonal systems are becoming disrupted. Insulin signaling is becoming weaker. And year after year, the metabolic burden slowly increases. This is why abdominal fat is so closely linked with conditions like insulin resistance, fatty liver disease, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. The waistline often reflects much more than external appearance. It reflects what may already be happening internally. And unfortunately, modern life creates the perfect environment for visceral fat accumulation. Ultra-processed foods, constant snacking, poor sleep, chronic stress, lack of movement, high sugar intake, refined carbohydrates. All of these create continuous energy overload inside the body. When the body receives more energy than it can efficiently use, it stores the excess, and one of the primary storage locations becomes the abdomen. But here is where the cycle becomes dangerous. As visceral fat increases, insulin resistance often worsens. And as insulin resistance worsens, the body becomes even more likely to store additional abdominal fat. This creates a vicious metabolic cycle that slowly strengthens over time. Many people blame themselves emotionally when this happens. They think they simply lack discipline, or motivation, or willpower. But biology is far more complicated than that. Hormones are involved. Inflammation is involved. Sleep quality is involved. Stress hormones are involved. The body's energy regulation systems are involved. Understanding that is important because shame does not improve metabolic health. Awareness does. Once you begin recognizing abdominal fat as a biological signal instead of simply an aesthetic concern, you start seeing your health very differently. Because the body is not trying to embarrass you. It is trying to communicate with you. And sometimes it communicates through signs people ignore every single day, including signs that appear directly on the skin itself. One of the clearest metabolic warning signs I notice in patients often appears in places many people rarely examine closely: the neck, the underarms, the groin area, sometimes even around the elbows or knuckles. People notice darker patches of skin forming gradually over time and assume it is dirt, aging, poor hygiene, or simple skin discoloration. But often, it is something much more important, a condition called acanthosis nigricans. And while the name sounds complicated, the meaning behind it is extremely important because it can be one of the earliest visible signs of elevated insulin levels inside the body. This surprises many people because they associate insulin problems only with diabetes, but insulin resistance usually begins years before diabetes is officially diagnosed. Long before blood sugar becomes severely elevated, the body is often already producing larger and larger amounts of insulin in an attempt to keep glucose under control. And insulin is not just a blood sugar hormone. It is also a growth signal. When insulin levels remain chronically elevated, certain skin cells begin responding to those signals by growing and thickening abnormally in areas where skin folds naturally occur. That is why these darker velvety patches begin appearing gradually. The skin is reflecting what is happening internally. And one of the reasons this sign matters so much is because it often appears while there is still time to reverse the process. That is the important part I want people to understand. These signs are not meant to create hopelessness. They are opportunities for awareness. The body is trying to reveal dysfunction before more severe disease develops. But unfortunately, most people ignore these changes because they do not realize what they mean. They scrub the skin harder. They buy creams. They assume it is cosmetic. Meanwhile, the underlying metabolic dysfunction continues progressing silently underneath the surface. And these visible skin changes are often only one piece of a much larger hormonal picture. Because when insulin resistance begins developing, many people also notice something else happening that they struggle to control. Their hunger changes, their cravings intensify, and no matter how much they eat, they often stop feeling truly satisfied for very long. One of the earliest metabolic warning signs many people completely misunderstand is persistent hunger. I am not talking about normal appetite. I am talking about the feeling that no matter how much you eat, satisfaction never seems to last very long. You finish a full meal and 1 hour later you are already searching for something sweet. You snack constantly throughout the day. You crave sugar late at night, even when you are not physically starving. And many people blame themselves for this. They think they simply lack self-control. But very often, the problem is not a lack of discipline. The problem is hormonal dysfunction. When visceral fat begins increasing and insulin resistance starts developing, the body's hunger regulation systems become disrupted. One of the hormones heavily involved in this process is leptin. Leptin is sometimes called the satiety hormone because its job is to help signal to the brain that enough food has been consumed. Under healthy conditions, leptin helps create the feeling of fullness after eating. But when metabolic dysfunction develops, the brain may stop responding properly to leptin signals. This is sometimes referred to as leptin resistance. The result is frustrating for many people. The body continues seeking food even when enough energy has already been consumed. And this creates another dangerous cycle. The more highly processed food a person consumes, the more unstable blood sugar and insulin levels often become, and the more unstable those systems become, the harder it becomes to regulate hunger naturally. That is why many people feel trapped in a cycle of cravings and overeating, while simultaneously feeling exhausted all the time. And exhaustion is another warning sign people normalize far too easily. I hear this constantly from patients. "Doctor, I'm just tired all the time." Not the normal tiredness that comes after one difficult day. I mean the deep, persistent fatigue that follows people everywhere. The exhaustion after meals, the afternoon energy crashes, the overwhelming sleepiness that appears even after eating lunch. Many people assume this is simply part of adulthood, but metabolically, it can be a very important clue. When the body becomes resistant to insulin, glucose cannot enter cells as efficiently as it should. In simple terms, fuel begins having trouble reaching the places where energy is actually produced. So even though sugar levels in the bloodstream may be elevated, the cells themselves struggle to use that energy effectively. The result is a strange contradiction. Too much fuel circulating in the blood, not enough energy reaching the cells efficiently. And over time, that metabolic inefficiency leaves many people feeling mentally and physically drained. But the problem often becomes even worse when sleep quality begins declining too. Poor sleep is one of the most underestimated metabolic stressors in modern life. People treat sleep deprivation as if it were simply an inconvenience. But biologically, inadequate sleep directly affects insulin sensitivity, appetite regulation, inflammation, stress hormones, and energy balance. Even one night of fragmented sleep can measurably increase insulin resistance the following day. Now imagine the effect of poor sleep repeating for months or years. The body becomes trapped in a cycle. Poor sleep increases cravings. Cravings increase excess calorie intake. Excess weight worsens insulin resistance. Insulin resistance worsens fatigue. Fatigue reduces physical activity, and reduced activity worsens metabolic dysfunction even further. This is why metabolic disease is never just about one isolated symptom. It is an interconnected network of hormonal, inflammatory, and energy regulation problems that slowly reinforce each other over time. And unfortunately, modern life accelerates this cycle in ways many people never fully realize. Because the environment surrounding us today is almost perfectly designed to overload the body metabolically. To truly understand why so many people develop diabetes, fatty liver disease, and cardiovascular disease, you have to understand the cycle that drives these conditions underneath the surface. And once you see the pattern clearly, you begin realizing why these diseases rarely happen suddenly. They are usually the result of years of silent metabolic pressure slowly building inside the body. Everything often begins with the modern food environment. Highly processed foods, constant access to sugar, refined carbohydrates, artificially engineered snacks designed to stimulate reward centers in the brain far beyond what natural foods normally do. These foods are specifically designed to keep people eating, and because they often produce weak satiety signals, people can consume enormous amounts of calories without ever feeling truly satisfied. Over time, this creates chronic energy overload. The body receives more fuel than it can efficiently use. And when excess energy continues entering the system day after day, the body stores the overflow, primarily as fat, especially visceral fat around the abdomen. But visceral fat is not just storage. It behaves almost like an inflammatory organ. It releases chemicals that interfere with insulin signaling and create chronic low-grade inflammation throughout the body. As this happens, the cells gradually become less responsive to insulin. This is insulin resistance. Under healthy conditions, insulin acts like a key that helps move glucose from the bloodstream into cells where it can be used for energy. But when insulin resistance develops, the key stops working efficiently. The glucose remains trapped in the bloodstream longer than it should. The pancreas notices rising blood sugar and responds by producing more insulin in an attempt to compensate. At first, the body manages to keep blood sugar relatively controlled through this compensation. But the cost is chronically elevated insulin levels, and high insulin levels promote even more fat storage. More fat storage worsens inflammation. More inflammation worsens insulin resistance, and the cycle tightens further. Year after year, quietly, relentlessly. This is why so many people develop prediabetes long before they are officially diagnosed with diabetes. The dysfunction often exists silently for years before standard blood sugar levels finally become abnormal enough to trigger concern. Meanwhile, another dangerous process may already be developing inside the arteries. Because chronic inflammation and metabolic dysfunction do not only affect body weight or blood sugar, They damage blood vessels too. Inside every artery is a delicate inner lining called the endothelium. When healthy, this lining remains smooth and flexible, allowing blood to flow efficiently throughout the body. But chronic inflammation gradually injures this protective layer. As the arterial wall becomes damaged, LDL cholesterol particles begin penetrating into the lining of the artery. The immune system recognizes this as a problem and sends inflammatory cells into the area. Over time, this creates plaque, a growing accumulation of cholesterol, inflammatory material, scar tissue, and cellular debris inside the arterial wall itself. And this process can continue silently for many years without symptoms. That is what makes cardiovascular disease so deceptive. People assume danger begins when chest pain appears. But in reality, the disease process often started decades earlier. The real tragedy is not the heart attack itself. The real tragedy is all the silent years beforehand when the body was already showing warning signs that nobody recognized. One of the biggest mistakes people make with metabolic health is waiting for obvious symptoms before checking what is happening inside their body. But by the time severe symptoms appear, damage has often been developing silently for years. That is why I always tell patients something very simple. Do not guess, measure. Because the body leaves clues long before disaster happens, and many of those clues appear clearly in laboratory testing. The symptoms we discussed earlier are warning signs, but blood work gives us the actual numbers. It shows us where the metabolism stands today, not where we hope it stands. And the good news is that most of these tests are simple, widely available, and relatively inexpensive. The first test I strongly recommend discussing with your doctor is fasting blood glucose. This measures the amount of sugar circulating in your bloodstream after approximately 8 hours without food. Ideally, we want that number below 100 milligrams per deciliter. When fasting glucose begins climbing between 100 and 125, we enter the range called prediabetes. And this is incredibly important because prediabetes is not harmless. It is the stage where the body is already struggling metabolically, even if full diabetes has not developed yet. Many people ignore prediabetes because they think, at least I don't have diabetes. But medically, prediabetes is often the warning phase where intervention matters most. Because at this stage, the body is still highly capable of improving when the right lifestyle changes are made consistently. The next test I consider extremely valuable is hemoglobin A1C, sometimes written as HbA1c. This test is powerful because it does not only show what your blood sugar looks like today, it shows what your blood sugar has been doing over roughly the last 3 months. Think of it almost like a long-term metabolic report card. Here is why that matters. Some people eat very carefully for 1 or 2 days before a blood test, hoping to improve the results temporarily. But HbA1c reflects patterns over time, not just one good day. Inside your red blood cells is a protein called hemoglobin. When blood sugar remains elevated, glucose attaches itself to that protein. The higher blood sugar stays over time, the more glucose becomes attached. That is what HbA1c measures. In general, a value below 5.7% is considered normal. Between 5.7% and 6.4% usually indicates prediabetes, and 6.5% or higher strongly suggests diabetes. What makes this test especially important is that it often reveals metabolic dysfunction long before people feel severely ill. And many patients are shocked when they finally see those numbers because outwardly they believed they were functioning normally. The third group of tests I pay close attention to is the lipid profile. This includes several important markers: total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, and triglycerides. Now, many people only focus on total cholesterol, but the full pattern matters much more. LDL cholesterol is often referred to as bad cholesterol because elevated levels contribute to plaque formation inside damaged arteries. HDL cholesterol helps remove excess cholesterol from the bloodstream and transport it back to the liver. Higher HDL levels are generally protective. Triglycerides are especially important metabolically because they often rise significantly in people consuming excess sugar, refined carbohydrates, and ultra-processed foods. And one pattern I pay extremely close attention to is high triglycerides combined with low HDL. That combination frequently suggests insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction are already active underneath the surface. In many cases, the body has been struggling long before diabetes is officially diagnosed. Another test many people overlook completely involves liver enzymes. This matters because one of the most underestimated conditions today is fatty liver disease. Millions of people have fat accumulating inside the liver without realizing it. And contrary to what many assume, this is not only related to alcohol. Insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction are major drivers of fatty liver disease. When fat begins infiltrating the liver, liver enzymes may start rising. That is the body signaling that the liver is under stress. And this matters because the liver plays a central role in blood sugar regulation, fat metabolism, inflammation control, and overall metabolic balance. When liver function becomes impaired, the entire metabolic system becomes more unstable. Now, here is the part I want you to remember most clearly. These numbers are not meant to shame you. They are information, and information creates opportunity, because one of the most dangerous things in medicine is not discovering disease. It is allowing disease to progress silently for years without ever looking. I have seen patients completely transform their health after finally understanding what their body was trying to tell them. Blood sugar improves, triglycerides improve, fatty liver improves, energy improves, inflammation decreases, and in many cases the earlier intervention begins, the more remarkable the recovery can become. But none of that happens through denial. It begins with awareness. It begins with measurement. And it begins with understanding that metabolic health is not determined by how healthy you think you feel today. It is determined by what is actually happening inside the body over time. That is why I want you to think back to the patient I told you about at the beginning of this video. The man who arrived in the emergency department convinced he was completely healthy. His body had been trying to warn him for years. The signs were there: the fatigue, the abdominal weight, the skin changes, the metabolic dysfunction. But nobody had explained what those signs truly meant. And that is exactly why conversations like this matter. Because if you are hearing this message today, there is still a very good chance your body is giving you an opportunity to change direction before something irreversible happens. Do not ignore that opportunity.